Hopefully the audio is slightly better. But yeah, so I'm kind of bummed today, so I'm going to be probably a little bit less overall excited for how things go, but that's the way it is. What can you say? Today, my goal is to spend a little bit of time going back over Anti-Oedipus. We're going through 3.9 currently, which is the civilized capitalist machine. I hope my audio is more acceptable. And Discord crashed. Wonderful, Discord. Good job. Oh, there it is. I don't know what's wrong with my computer today. Goal is to go over AO. I'm sharing pages from it, and we're going to kind of discuss overall what's happening inside of 3.9 as they begin it, the civilized capitalist machine, the general movement of how they make it, what capitalism is, and the big play that they're making here that sort of follows on from how we've been discussing multiple sociuses, how we've been discussing the social fields of various times and how we get to ours. How this works inside of Discord or anything is simple. Type out a question. If you want to ask a question in audio, please join our Discord. There's links everywhere. Most of you, I think, are already members. Come if you aren't. Otherwise, we'll be basically just going through until I decide that I'm tired or I get, I don't know, misty and decide to reminisce about my old boss or whatever. My boss, it's been a tough day. He's one of the two people who probably had most impact on my career. The other one would be my other boss from the company, same company. So it was a really formative time for me. So, hey, what can you say? But let's do Anti-Oedipus. Ms., is my audio any better, or is it still absolute shit? I'm hoping it's at least slightly better. Good. No, serious. This is anything up to the point. I'm going to start a little bit in 3.9 because we have a handful of people who are part of our normal reading, and I wanted to sort of spend a little bit of time going over some stuff that I don't want to say I have a tougher time with, but that's probably the easiest way to phrase it. AO is not an easy book. It just isn't an easy book. So if you're going to be spending time inside of it and we're going to be go ahead and, doing anything really inside of it, I like to spend a little bit of time beating up on ideas in front of a crowd so that way people can tell me when I'm stupid. I like that. I'm a fan of being told I'm really dumb. So give me a few moments, but we'll make our way back. Serious, don't worry. I'm down for very simple questions. And if you want to join the Discord, if you're not, just DGQC, discord.gg/DGQC. Easy to get to. So Anti-Oedipus. At this point, we're making our way into 3.9. The book as a whole is trying to take us through a genealogy of how we got to this point that our subjectivity is formed as it is in capital, but also through a critique that allows us to see differently how our subjectivity is formed than we have been seeing. The way they go about this is by talking about things in terms of desiring production. This is the baseline through basically the entire chapter 3. We first go through the Earth Socius. The Earth Socius is the time sort of prehistorical, you can say a sort of anarcho-communist sort of lives that the prehistorical people lived in, the uncontacted tribes, prehistory, effectively. Here, because there was no central governing authority, the way desire was produced and the way social production happened was basically through a just more immediate necessity. So when you have your family, the ability to create more people, the ability to do work, your filiative line, where you come from and what you make. This combines with your alliant line, the friendships you make, the alliances you form, the trading you do with other people. This setup and this sort of pathway lets people sort of exist in a non-centralized power structure, but in a very simplistic format. One that requires us to literally carve into the skin, us to literally do horrifying things in order to sort of make sure people don't do stuff, to give you an awareness of where you sit inside of the hierarchy of things. And it's not a hard hierarchy. It's more of a traditionally sort of, back and forth. There's a chief, but the chief isn't an edict giver. He doesn't control everyone. Instead, your desire is more or less co-opted almost immediately by the earth. We give blessings to the earth. We thank the earth for things. The earth claims desire, claims production of desire for itself. We thank the earth for the bounties. We thank the earth for a child being born, blah, 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 all that. This is a lot of human existence. At some point, someone comes along and basically says, hey, by the way, everyone is descended from me. And also, by the way, all trading is done underneath me. This is generally thought of as the king, the despot, the dictator, the singular point where the social order is through a person. Now, the person isn't really the important thing. It's more the designation of it. They opened the session by talking about how Abraham united the tribes. We had a comment on that video that I answered today. Abraham didn't exist in the time of the 12 tribes. I hope I didn't misspeak and say that. When we talk about Abraham uniting the tribes or being responsible for the tribes, he is in the place of despot. All things are happening because of and through him. He died a while back. It's his kid. God ordained Abraham that his seed would grow, multiply, and become the 12 tribes. And so as such, the 12 tribes of Judea, the sort of Abrahamic religions, all descend from this. This single point is a unique one. He gives edicts, he controls, he sets what we're doing. The Abrahamic law, for example, determines what people do. You do things on behalf of this God, this Godhead, this creature, this character, whatever it may be. So there's this really odd switch to it being this single point that determines what we do and how we set up. But unlike the earth, which basically co-opts immediately, you're hungry, we need to go get food, bring it back, someone else needs to cook it, this sort of immediate action. Now we have the need for someone to hand out edicts, carve laws into stone tablets, you might say. This changes our relationship with each other and with words and with law. Whereas under the earth socius, we did things out of necessity. This movement into the despotic makes it so the edicts that come down and the control that's given has to be interpreted. Exegesis becomes a thing. The exegetical sort of nature of laws. Abraham said, thou shalt not kill. They killed a bunch. So why did they do that? Well, it's because they interpreted, and interpretation of the law became a thing. Became a question of not so much what is the despot's desire, what do I desire, but instead the necessity of I desiring what the despot desires. This desire of desire is sort of a second step. It's a disjunctive relationship because I no longer am just connecting with things and immediately consuming desire, which isn't necessarily great, more earth socius, but now I'm seeing things and understanding if the despot wants this to be the case and interpreting through the eyes of the despot. This goes on for a huge amount of time. There's lots of cultures, lots of gigantic singular kings, Roman Empire, British Empire, whatever it is, empires. And this type of production is always then ascribed to the despot. Because what matters is what co-opts production. It's really taking Marx to an extreme level. It's not a question of it's always been the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. No, it's a question of what co-opts production. At some point, capital exists. Now, merchants and marketplaces have always been around. This is a very boring and trite way to talk about capitalism here. The way that the despot turns into capital is a very unique little thing. It's not just one. There's a bunch of little pieces. There's the way language works. There's a lot of other stuff. But there's one really interesting thing. And it's how capital functions. And this is what they open up this sort of this entire section sort of with, the civilized capitalist machine, this movement into it. I want to sort of take from probably 2 paragraphs here. I want to kind of read through and discuss and sort of take questions on this. Feel free to ask questions. I'll do what I can to answer it. But you can see on screen the part I'm reading. I'm going to start at the dissolutions are defined. So within this, because we're talking about Marx, we're talking about capital, this moving of the decoding of the landed flux, the flux français, the privatization of property, decoding of monetary flux, all of these things are preconditions for capitalism, to say, or the example feudalism, or what really feudalism actually was, the medieval sort of existence. There again, private property, commodity production, monetary afflux, the extension of the market, development of towns, appearance of manorial ground rent in money form, or the contractual hiring of labor do not produce a capitalist economy. Instead, this economy reinforces the current structure, the despotic structure that is happening. This is not capitalism. There's a marketplace, there's money, there's taxes, there's all those pieces that we need in order to build capital, but we aren't quite there. This shift happens, as he says, and they start talking about with a little bit of a different play. And they want to talk about specifically why it happened where it did, and not inside of what you could easily say are longer, more developed, more complex societies happening in the East. They say, let us return to this eminently contingent question that modern historians know how to ask. Why Europe, not China? Apropos, sorry, real quick. Where'd it go? Oh, damn it, I lost my place again. Oh, right here. Why Europe, not China? Apropos of ocean navigation, Ferdinand Braudel asks, why not Chinese, Japanese, or even Muslim ships? Why not Sinbad the sailor? It's not the technique, it's not the technical machine that is lacking. Isn't it rather that desire remains caught in the nets of the despotic state, entirely invested in the despot's machine? Perhaps, and this is a quote from Braudel, perhaps the merit of the West, confined as it was on its narrow Cape of Asia, was to have needed the world, to have needed to venture outside its own front door. This is Braudel's wonderful writing he did on this, and I love the phrase at the Cape of Asia, because it's important to remember Europe was not nearly as developed as a lot of other parts of the world. Actually, it was fairly backwards in comparison in a lot of ways. It didn't have deeply complex economic chains. India and China did. They have spices and food and bounty and riches and a lot of ability to sort of handle things themselves. Europe was fairly dependent on basically trade from the East and trade from other areas, and was sort of in an odd place. And so what it meant is that the Cape of Asia necessitated that people go out. And this changes how people, again, relate to the world. We're going to start seeing the word territorial a lot as we make our way further into the book. They've been using it already a bunch, but here it's important to realize the anthropological origin of the term. When we talk about someone voyaging, when we talk about someone leaving their land behind, we talk about the territory a person has. But if an uncontacted tribe lives on an island, they have the territory. Their territoriality is the world. It's everything they know, everything they see. It's all of that setup. When they move around, they may extend it, see another island. The territory may expand, but the territoriality is generally that space. When you have a ship from nowhere you've ever been that changes your view of things, the people become deterritorialized. When you're actually actively looking to completely find new spaces, to completely find a new redistribution, to completely move beyond this, this is when you make a step and actually move in a way where you're talking about decoding desire in a voyage. And this is when they start making their way into talking about, as they say, the decoded desires, or the desire for decoding always exists. History is full of them. But we have seen that only through their encounter in a place, their conjunction in a space that takes time, do decoded flux constitute a desire that, instead of just dreaming or lacking, actually produces a desiring machine that is at the same time social and technical. That is why capitalism and its break are defined not solely by a decoded flux, but by the generalized decoding of flux, a new massive deterritorialization, the conjunction of deterritorialized flux. It is the singular nature of this conjunction that ensured the universality of capitalism. By simplifying a lot, and they are simplifying a lot, the rest of the book covers this, we can say that the savage territorial machine operated on the basis of connections of production, and that the barbarian despotic machine was based on disjunctions of inscription derived from that immanent unity. But the capitalist machine, the civilized machine, will first establish itself on that conjunction. And you can look through the three socii and start seeing these three sort of setups. You have at first, you have your primary that sort of sets you up to be part of the connective, the earth socius. Then the disjunctive, which is where we find the despotic socius. And then we have the third set, which is the capitalist socius. We see that this is where it sets up. It sets up on the conjunction quite directly, and that's the setup. So as we make our way sort of through these things, as we step up, we're now making our move into the conjunction of the decoded flux. We're making our way through the way that desiring production is produced today. It's a lot. Don't get me wrong. I am not saying that this isn't deeply complex, but this movement, we're going to see them come back to over and over and over again through the entirety of the rest of the book. So this is where I wanted to sort of start us off and then see if there's question that sort of leads into this, connected to this, really from anywhere in the book. But this is really where we spent our time this week. So I kind of wanted to, have some fun and sort of talk through that. So, Sirius, you got a bunch. Do you want to jump on stage here real quick? And we can just talk rather than...
Oh, yeah, sure. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah. All I wanted to ask, I guess, was in relation to what you were saying a little bit earlier about the despot, right? Because you were talking about how, like, the very simplified story, and I'm not saying that this is the only story, but it's what you were saying is basically somebody came along one day and was like, and I guess declared themselves the despot or forced themselves to be the despot, right? But I'm wondering.
Well, I'm oversimplifying a bit.
Yes, I know. So that's what I wanted to ask about is what allowed for that to take place? Like, was there a specific material change that happened or environmental change, or was this always a potential thing that could have happened and it just didn't for a long time, or what?
So the best explanation I've seen of it is when we talk about Asiatic production. And it's a thing Marx talks about, but better other works have come along. There's a really great book that sort of goes over it that talks about it as, he talks about it really interestingly in terms of hydro societies. Now, his reason for that is that societies and groups of people get so complex that at some point, and it's not a fine line, it's more of a emergent thing, but at some point that it necessitates people specializing. The idea being that if you live, for example, let's say ancient Greece or in the space where ancient Greece became, you need water, you need food. Small group of people can handle that. You live by a river, live near a river, but at some point you need to start mastering not just irrigation, but getting water to people. And actually this very particularly is where he sort of places the sort of change happening, that as soon as you have enough people to necessitate the control of water, you have to have people not only specialized, but you have to have someone sort of take charge of it. And it isn't necessarily that a person comes along and goes, oh, hello, I'm God. But suddenly that one person is the one who's in charge of it, or starts doing the work to claim it, or has some control over the tributary or the water. There's a lot of sort of ways that Brodel and a handful of others sort of talk about this. But this move is kind of where we start to see the shift from sort of the anarcho-communist Earth socius to where a person is in charge. And it's a person being in charge, and there's a lot of things that sort of happen, fall back on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this move is where we start to see a more centralized state capacity come along with it. And the state is a necessity for this. The state and the despot emerge at once, because in order to be in charge of many things, you need a bureaucracy. And bureaucracy we call now huge groups of people. It doesn't have to be huge groups. It can be a guy who goes from like the 3 towns or the 2 towns or 2 villages that you sort of run and tells them, hey, by the way, this has to get done. But that lapse in time is a necessity, and the temporality of it, the delay of orders, the delay of getting things, all of this starts becoming the reality of the life that is lived at the time. And again, it's important when we look back to realize the subjectivity as it exists and how it becomes. So when people go, hey, we need you guys to do this, they allow the despot allows them to maintain like whatever rituals or anything locally they have, but now they're contributing to a larger project. And they just do, because again, this is part of that odd thing that the Earth Socialist feeds into. So there's a lot happening here in that transition, but it's really focused on the state and how they sort of talk about is water power, water, food, large scale sort of infrastructure becoming part of a more complex group as the size of people come along, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure. No, please. You're here.
So so that's an interesting, so if I understand correctly, they're talking about, I guess, water power, to very, very, very simplify what you were saying,
Yeah.
right? And like control of that as being as requiring a kind of bureaucracy to form around it, which then gives rise to the despot.
Mhm.
So I was wondering, how do they feel that something like agriculture fits into this story? Because like I'm coming, I guess, from a background of like having read a lot of like James C. Scott, for example, and other anthropologists who would more put the emergence of like these large bureaucracies not necessarily in control of water, but more the administration of like agricultural products, or specifically sedentary agriculture, that you needed this bureaucracy to form up to keep track of agricultural output and that kind of stuff. So like, do they feel that agriculture has a role in this story at all, or do they think that no, that's like a distraction from other things?
So the big focus again in water isn't really the thing itself either. They're quoting a guy who's talking about the Asiatic means of production in that sense, because that tends to be how he speaks of it. Again, it is about the emergence of these elements, the state coming along. To quote, in point of fact, that is what forms the specific character of Asiatic production. The autochthonous rural communities subsist, continue to produce, inscribe, and consume. In effect, they are the state's sole concern. The wheels of the territorial lineage machine subsist, but are no longer anything more than the working parts of now a state machine. The objects, the organs, the persons, the groups retain a part of their coding, but these coded flux of the former regime find themselves overcoded by a transcendent unity that appropriates surplus value. And this is the thing that is happening. It's the overcoding. So when you talk about desire being coded, for example, in the Earth Socius, it isn't coded in terms of desire becoming a specific thing, but the desire becomes utilized and coded in a more complex social system. You see certain women are to be married off, have children, some cook, men do this, X and Y, people do X and Y, but it's not hard coded or over coded at large. It's very contingent. This is how desire gets coded. When we move into the despotic, desire becomes over coded because necessarily the unity of the thing codes over the desire that is happening emergently underneath. It's necessity of that. So when the despot or someone comes along and says, no, actually, your group is going to be the one you guys are carving out marble. That's what you guys are doing. You're giving us all the marble in the world. That setup, that overcoding of what happens, you're not going to be a hunter. You're going to be a marble cutter. The overcoding of desire takes place. This is however anthropologists want to talk about it. The thing that is important to them is specifically that we understand the social relationship or coding of desire changing and how the social world is produced. It being a farm or water or anything is almost irrelevant because these things become the shape of it and sort of an after image. Instead, it's important to take a look at how desire and subjectivity is formed, particularly in these ways, and what are the parts of the machine as we make our way through.
Okay, that makes sense. Like you're saying that like it being specifically water is not the point that they're making. Like the point that they're making is like the process that results, not specifically
it's the
not
process
like
that produces the social system that we name,
right.
instead of
Okay.
presuming from the social system that we named that we know the process.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. Again, I've only just started, so
No. It's fine. Again, it's a deeply complex book.
It is.
Let me see. Holland I'm always a fan of Holland. One second. Holland has a great take on this specifically because of the way he words it. One sec.
Yeah.
Pull that up. I have too many
Also, just
secondary texts.
a quick point of clarification. Like when we say overcoded, we mean that it's coding over something that was already there, not
Correct.
that it's not that there's too much code, right?
No, we're not talking about it being like overcharged.
Okay.
Not like that or overpowered. It's overcoded, literally writing over the original.
Okay.
At some point, one sec, there's a great phrasing that they use for overcoding where they talk about it's specifically it's how the state operates in it, but it's a great phrasing for it. Old documents, because parchment paper was extremely expensive. Often what you'd find in these documents is actually that they would either paint over oh, I fucked up, or hey, we don't need this document anymore, I need to make a new one. They'd paint over or sort of simply go over the original text, and you end up with these layers of new code on top of, and they use that as the phrasing around this. That kind of thing is what overcoding is.
Okay. So, I mean, I guess maybe to relate it to something I do know, it kind of sounds a lot like what Scott talks about with legibilization, how in order to be made legible to the state imposes specific like ways of keeping track of people and land and stuff like that, and that's how you get the emergence of stuff like last names or legal name, or why you have something like money, even because money is an easy way of keeping track of production, and also is an easy way of getting some like a uniform tribute to the despot. Does that connect at all?
No, I would probably say, if we're talking like at that point, we start talking actually about things that may run counter to this and the questions, and they would have critiques. So for example, the idea of having a single unitary currency, accurate, but is it because that's what they want when you give it? The despot doesn't care about his currency. The despot cares about what the currency does, or his ability to basically utilize it as power with others, so to buy gold, to use it in trade with other societies, to get married to the queen or princess of another society, to take them over, to wage war, to give way. Like what the despot uses these for, it's not quite. I guess that I would say that's kind of for me, like that stuff doesn't really connect with a lot of this. The way social organization operates inside of this, and there's pieces that start getting made. As I said before, we went to Capital, and I sort of listed out all the stuff that despotism does build, and they do through the state build bureaucracy. We do end up with a currency, but again, currency doesn't really matter in the same way to the despot. It doesn't work the same way to the despot. The despot is the reason everything is done, and all is done for him. It's undisguised, pure political power that sort of runs straight through that position of the king or the queen or whoever it happens to be. This infinite debt is now laid to them. This existence you have is now about determining what is happening, what the despot wants, and what it means when he says anything. So this change in how we deal with things, and this is, again, because we're going real base layer, we're not really talking about the social as being the end all be all. Instead, what we want to talk about is how the social impacts desiring production and how desire is made. So when we talk about like the way that desire works inside of the earth socius, you end up with a negative image. And this is, they talk about this thing, the displaced represented, which is sort of an understanding of what is not necessarily forbidden, but things that simply are not done because that's just the way things are. It's a positive sort of image that's created, but there's a negative side to it. That existence gives way to the despot, who now has the ability to sort of take on anything he needs to. And he becomes this repressing representation of desire. So you end up in sort of an odd place where desire, as it's being produced through desiring production, and again, not your desire, all the desire that is making you and making choices for you, and your passions and sadnesses, the stuff like Spinoza talked about, not I want a car, but instead like the passions that drive you on a daily basis. That thing and how it's being made is now shifting, and it's shifting how it functions. Instead of being something that's about a positive movement directly in front of you with a bit of a negative outside, now you have a negative outside, and it's actually direct. Now you will deal directly with this. You have a repression that comes directly from the despot. They use incest as being the setup, and it can be a lot of other social mores. It doesn't have to be incest. Incest is just the one they do because, Oedipus is kind of what the book's about. So when they say, in the imperial formation, incest has ceased to be a displaced representative of desire to become a repressing representation itself. The way the despot has of committing incest, making it possible, in no way involves removing the apparatus of social and psychic repression. On the contrary, the despot's intervention forms part of the apparatus itself, a new economy in this repressive, repressing apparatus, a new mark, new severity. It would be too easy if it were enough to make incest possible. Incest is not possible. Instead, the royal barbarian incest is merely the means of overcoating desire, not a means of liberating them. So this position of the despot becomes one of basically envy. He, as Holland said, he concentrates in his person the function of this anti-productive expenditure for the entire empire, all of its people. He exercises the right of eminent domain over everything that is produced and reproduced, including people, as well as very life and death of the people themselves. Inasmuch as everything absolutely is owed to the despot, all organs, products, persons belong to him. His transcendent position is inherently at the same time paranoid, necessarily, because the repressed representative of desire is like this infinite debt that he owes to himself. And so everything around him, this multiplication of organs and production and everything that he has as part of his full body. The despot is the full body of everyone. This changes not just his interaction, but everyone's interaction with this. They are all part of this large sort of organ surface, tons of them connected, this full body. It's sort of nightmarish if you think about it, a little bit of the thing. But this setup is a system of terror and death. And it's one that implicitly everyone at the time experienced, including the despot. This system and how it worked hand in hand with the written word and the spoken word. This is a big deal to how D&G talk about this, because it's, again, the necessity of how people do things. How do you run and have a bureaucracy? Well, you have to have the written word. The written word didn't work as it worked then, as it does now, or as it did in the graphism or the cave drawings of ancient. It's very different ways that these things operate. And so when you talk about the voice, or you talk about the written word of the king being an edict, it's now about interpreting it the way that you'll see even today in debates where people talk past each other because they're both appealing to definitions of words that aren't even related to what they're necessarily talking about, but they're kind of outside of it, because to them, they need to divine the meaning of the word. They need to appeal to that. What is it that the despot wants when he says, "Thou shalt not kill"? He means, "Thou shalt not kill my subjects." That's what he means, even though he didn't say it exactly, because we're not talking about exact words. We're talking about what does he mean? And that's kind of then changing our entire relationship with how we even talk or communicate at a basic level. So when our desire is then produced through this system, when we see words, when we interact with it, all of this happens before there's even a subjectivity to go, well, why is it happening? Because that doesn't happen. We don't get to that point because already we're being headed off at the pass. Our desire before it can get there is going, oh, wait. It's not so much that I'm thinking, why don't I get something? It's the connection and the disconnection. The disconnection is very particular. It's a either or. What is meant? Does he mean this or that? Can't be both. Can't be both. And it's done. That's the end of desiring production. It's written this way. So as I exist in these societies, along comes capital, along comes exploration, along comes the ability for more of these either ors to sort of both be true, which is fucky. It's a completely fucking weird thing to have a inclusive disjunction. It's a thing that if you go back and you look, it isn't really around. But an inclusive disjunction starts being possible. And also lots of other disjunctions start popping up. And now desiring production actually has another step. Now capital is there. Now all of these other things start being produced, and we move into this other format where now desire has the conjunction. It's the coalescing of many of those things together. And we have a subjectivity that claims all of it for itself. And we do this through capital specifically. Sorry for the long ramble. I know, serious. It's no fun, but
No, it's fine. It's definitely a lot, though. I might have to.
it is. Well, it's
This
you asked a big question, and I'm trying to make it simple because when we talk about like how these things happen or what the moment is, the big if I were to try to answer like the most simple way, they want us to step away from the idea that there is a such thing as a particular social formation that the despotic always is, or that the earth socialist always is, that the organization of society isn't really the thing. Instead, it's how desire is utilized and co-opted inside of that society. That's the thing that separates it out. So when the earth claims it for itself, when the despot does, or when the market does, capital, this is actually where we start to see the ability to grasp how desire is made, how we choose what happens, and how what happens chooses for us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and this is what they were. This is like the falling back on, right? Like
Correct.
this is okay. This is like the recording surface. Is the word like miraculating the? In my translation it was miraculating, but I know that you guys have issues with the translation that they have, but
I do.
Yeah. Speaking of, I do have one last question, but I can
Please. No, I don't.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask, because I'm working with like all the issues. I'm working with a translation that has like all these issues. I wanted to ask, I guess, about the difference that you all see between like flux versus flow, and like why you think one is more appropriate than the other. Because from my vantage, I don't have nearly the kind of understanding required to even evaluate that.
I'm going to give my three quick reasons, and they're and again, it's the kind of thing where I don't actually consider it to be a very debatable point anymore. I've had enough conversations with deleuze experts. If you want a very, very complex version of it, the reality is that the fluxion is part of the mathematical setup for the derivative, and the way that lines come into a lot of what deleuze and guattari write throughout, not just this book, but also ATP. It is incredibly important to the mathematical conception of how they want to do this, because ultimately they come from a bit of a Spinozist geometric sort of view of the ability for us to play in a space that's both abstract but also real. So that's important, and it's one. But one, flux is what literally is the word in French. So just if you want like a nerdy little translation thing, couler or flux is, you could say both. So like the river is flowing, couler or flux would probably work fine, but there's subtle differences. Couler is like if I were to say the water is flowing out of the tap, you'd probably use couler. If I were to say the water burst from my toilet, you'd use flux. And flux is about the rate of change as the focal element versus the transfer of things. Flowing, water traveling. Flux is the bursting. So when we talk about the flux of desire, we mean the bursting forth of desire. It's the easiest version of this is the reason that we would use it, for example, in orgasm. The flux of semen, you wouldn't say, oh yes, the semen flows. I mean, maybe, but that's not my experience. That's not the word I would fucking use. Like piss flows, cum doesn't. That's kind of the difference here. It's not about sort of a steady pathway. It's about the moment of the explosion and the transfer of it to a new machine starting up because of that transfer, because of that force, and the force being important, and the transfer to the next. Now that's more the translation side of things. The last bit would be the philosophical side, which is if you're talking about the flow of capital, it's an absolutely useless term. It's money that flows. Great, money flows through things. Wonderful. We're not talking about the flux of capital, the flux of it. You're talking about the actual moment where you have, the actual change and the bursting and the shifting of value. If anyone here wants to take a look at a crypto market exchange, and you can see the difference between a flux and a flow, and tell me if you would use the word flow when you talk about a flow of money instead of radical changes up or down in terms of how capital is moving from one place to another. It's flux is the center of effectively their entire argument when you start getting into this book. And so when we talk about desire, we talk about like libidinal desire. Again, it's not your desire. It's that setup. It's the flux, the burst of the thing, rather than the flowing of it. Pippa says, sounds like the concept is spurt. No, because again, a spurt would be just boop, but it's the flux being the, what would be a good way to put it? Energy that flows from one thing to another, electrical pathways. We use the term flux instead of a flow of electricity. Flow of electricity doesn't make sense. Flux is rate of change over time, very particularly in physics, because the thing that concerns us is about that element, the rate of change within time or within a specific field. That thing is what they're driving at, and they want us to see and understand within desire. Does that make sense, Pippa? Serious?
Yeah, so like if I guess if I want to try to make sure, the idea is that flow kind of it insinuates, or I guess implies, that there's a kind of like constant rate of exchange here, or of like one thing to the next, whereas with flux, the entire object of study is the rate of change over time, the fact that there is this burst of creation at a specific point.
And it's the difference over time. Mm-hmm. So yes. Again, Deleuze is a bit of a philosopher of difference. So we're not talking representationally, we're talking about the suddenness, the force, the burst, the explosion, the flux of it, and the, again, rate of change, le différence within the thing itself. So it's a force.
Okay, I think I get that.
Flow isn't really a force.
Gotcha. All right, I'm gonna leave the stage now because I've monopolized like all of the time. I'm sorry.
You are free to. I'll probably give it a few more minutes. If there's other questions, I just got hit. I've got to go do some dadding stuff, and then I'll probably be back on a little bit later. Yeah, and I'm here to answer questions. Let's see what we can else get. Titan says, flux have a connotation of smoothness or inevitability. Flux can only move in one direction as inertia. Flux moves. Flux, it doesn't really move. That's the part that's kind of interesting. Flux is like a now. Flux is an immediate thing. Flux happens within Durée for Bergson. Flux is, the rate of change over time, the difference. There's a whole bunch of stuff that sort of goes into this. And it's fascinating in the AO translation, very specifically. I believe Deleuze uses words in certain ways. And so if he uses the word culer, which he does, I would translate that as flow. And if he ever used flux, I would just translate flux. What's fucked up is in the English translation that everyone uses, everything that's couler is half the time translated as flux or flow, and then flux is usually translated as flow. So it's like deeply confusing. I mean, translations are a pain in the ass, but what are you going to do, right? It's just a very frustrating thing. But yeah, flux, kind of important shit, to say the least. This play also really, it gives us a subjectivity in a place that we're in that's really super important. When we talk about the state of change that we find ourselves in, or our subjectivity finds ourselves in, it's deeply important to understanding that. Grayon says this is calculus heavy. No, this is calculus. It's not calculus heavy. I would just say we're just straight up in calculus. We're not at that point quite yet fully. I mean, to just come back to where we were in the reading really quick. One sec. Come on. I know you're letting me search. I know you're gonna let me search. Here, I'll stream the page up, get a little bit. When we talk about capital, and when I say we're just doing, basically we're advanced math, period. Money is not capital. Capital is not money. Susan de Brunoff wrote a wonderful book. I highly suggest to anyone here, if you have a misconception about how Marx or anyone really talks about cash. The money that I pay you as your boss, the money you pay someone else for buying a car, this is currency. This is money. This is exchange currency. Marx called it commodity currency, exchange currency, blah, blah, blah. Doesn't matter. This is cash. I exchange this with you. You exchange it with me. It doesn't really have power except for its own value. And its own value is kind of set in this large scale marketplace. Industrial capital, or capital, as I'm going to start just saying, is very different. It's the same dollar in theory, kind of bullshit, but it's the same dollar, but what it does is different. To just read, it's at the end here, and then we'll go into the paragraph just to read, because this is just Marx. Value in process, money in process, as such capital, value, suddenly presents itself as an independent substance, endowed with a motion of its own, in which money and commodities are mere forms which it assumes and casts off in turn. The exchange currency. Nay more, instead of simply representing the relations of commodities, it enters now, so to say, into relations with itself. And he means this in a sexual way. It differentiates itself as original value from itself as surplus value, as the father differentiates himself qua the son, yet both are of one and of one age. For only by the surplus value of 10 pounds does the 100 pounds originally advanced become capital. If I buy a pizza shop for you for $100, and I just go, look at that fucking pizza shop, that's just exchange currency. But if I buy that pizza shop and I use it to make pizza and sell to people, that $100 produces an extra 10. Now it becomes capital. That original 100. It's an important distinction in Marx. This is, most people don't read beyond book 1. This is book 3, I believe. Highly recommend Marx, by the way. Guy knew some stuff. Susanna Brunoff takes it much further. Great little short read. Susanna Brunoff, Marx on Money. It's on our server. Go find it somewhere. Great little read. That really goes into this. But money, when it's used in different ways, works differently. If you believe that the dollar you have is the same dollar that Elon Musk is using, or that Berkshire Hathaway is using, this is the great lie you're being told. Because what they're doing with their dollar is very, very different. Very different than you buying things or selling things or whatever it is. This is where we move into, as you were saying, Grayon, the space of calculus. We are no longer in the domain of the quantum or the quantitas, but in that of a differential relation as a conjunction that defines the immanent social field particular to capitalism. We'll start there. I'm not going to keep reading. The differential relation. The differential relation is, God, I don't like teaching math. I don't like math. But it is the change over time of a thing, the mark on a board that shifts the way the graph moves. The differential relation determines where the graph is and where it'll be going. And it's the change in that line. This is more a philosophical setup. I know it's not exact mathematics, but it's kind of playing into that. This as conjunction, combining, that defines the immanent social field particular to capital. It's dx over dy, which we'll see, combining together, that places value into different things, and as such determines the social field and confers on the abstraction as such its effectively concrete value, its tendency to concretization. The capital dollars don't really have value, not in and of themselves. They're not concrete dollars. They can still be won or lost. They have a tendency towards a concretization. We buy and sell them. That's great. But they don't really have a hard line value in the same way that $5 does when you can go spend it on gas. The abstraction has not ceased to be what it is, but it no longer appears in the simple quantity as a variable relation between independent terms. It has taken upon itself the independence, the quality of the terms, the quantity of the relations. The abstract itself posits the more complex relation within it, which will develop like something concrete. This is the important one. So this is the differential relation dy dx. Derivative y derives from labor power, constitutes the fluxion of variable capital. I'll explain that in a second. And dx derives from capital itself, constitutes the fluxion of constant capital. Variable capital and constant capital, when you have a business, this is the value of what you're doing. This is, by the way, this is the value of what you're doing. This is the value of what you're doing too, not just a business person. I said this and someone corrected me, and it's probably fair. The easiest way to understand this is if I have X amount of capital and I need to make money, I need to come out positive, ahead of the game. I have basically to spend on two things: the shit it costs to run a thing, and also the people it costs to run it. Now, if I am going to have, let's say I'm Liquid Death Company, and I'm going to make a bunch of these cans filled with water. There's only so much I can do to get the cost of the can down. There's only so much I can do to get the cost of the water down. Inking, printing, the literal costs of the hardware, the industrial apparatuses, the packaging, all of the stuff that's like there. I can't do very much about that. But there's this other thing I can do. The people who have to run these machines, I can pay them like shit. That's awesome, because that's variable capital. The lower I can get that number, the more money I end up with, the more profit I end up with, the more capital that comes out the other side. And this is the setup. This is the, as they say, the filiative form of capital, x plus dx. So if we have constant capital, we have the leftover profit from how much I was able to get from labor that goes into that. I have capital, money, that made money. And they use the term filiative here quite literally. It's money that birthed money. I didn't birth my son. We're not quite there yet, I guess. But I didn't birth my son, but he's my son. I gave him life, as you might say. Like, we talk about it this way. But it's not really how it works. Capital doesn't really birth itself either, but it does. It makes more of itself in these very particular circumstances and in these particular ways. The differential relation expresses the fundamental capitalist phenomenon of the transformation of the surplus value of code into a surplus value of flux. Surplus value of code into a surplus value of flux. X plus dx, the derivative that's made, the way capital moves. The code, which is the things produced, it is the people and what it took for them to get there, the code of life that exists for labor people. This gets transferred into this. And now we're talking about the rate of change and the fluxion that is within the entirety of the marketplace that's determining what you do. You don't know. This is what you are doing. You are doing this right now. How much constant capital do you have? You are spending it on your computer, you're spending it on everything else. How much labor power do you have? You have yourself. You have maybe one other person who's helping you do a thing. Out the other side, you're not making a fucking profit. I don't think any of us are who are here. If you're making a profit, proud to you. But that setup, your ability to make a profit is literally what gives value to you or allows you power to enact yourself within society, within the social order, to basically place your will into a space. And this determines what is made. This determines how it's made. This determines all of those things. This shift is a big deal. As he says, the fact that a mathematical appearance here replaces the old code simply signifies that one is witnessing a breakdown of the subsisting codes and territorialities for the benefit of a machine of another species, functioning in an entirely different way. It's no longer the cruelty of life, the terror of one life brought to bear on another, but a post-mortem despotism. The despot become anus and vampire. Anus is the ability for us to control expulsion. In psychoanalytic thought, it's more of a poetic thing. It's our ability to control and expel when we need to, waste. And vampire, because that's what capital is ultimately. It's dead labor that needs new labor to feed on to become alive again. So now, this setup, the despot has made his way into being capital, and he is about controlling expulsion and utilizing dead labor, utilizing new fresh labor to power old dead labor. To quote from Marx, capital is dead labor that vampire life only lives by sucking living labor, lives the more labor it sucks. Industrial capital, investment capital, doesn't matter, all of those things, thus offer a new filiation that is a constituent part of the capitalist machine, in relation to which commercial capital and financial capital will now take the form of a new alliance by assuming specific functions within that. This is how capital came to be. And this is what capital is. So anytime people tell you, oh, it's a marketplace, I don't want a marketplace. Oh, we don't want investment. All of these things, they're not really the thing. Even according to Marx, none of these are really the thing. The thing that makes capital is X plus DX. It is the way that constant capital and variable capital interact to produce profit. And that profit then being used again to further extract more value, to further break down codes and continue the push forward. This is what capitalism is. And that's why we take that really long roundabout nightmare that we've gone through for psychoanalysis, through all of the other things, because in order to understand the fluxion, in order to understand how codes operate, in order to understand mathematically how labor comes to be or how this works, you have to be able to grasp the entirety of all of these steps, because we didn't just get here because of one thing. There's a lot of pieces and a lot of stuff going on and a lot of things that are machines moving into other machines that are fucking with other social orders. The entirety of this depends on a state apparatus that's saying, oh no, here is the actual value of the dollar. If it didn't do that, I wouldn't be able to invest in anything. It'd be like fucking crypto. If people couldn't pull their crypto out into dollars, it would all be worthless. Because you need to be able to come back to that home cash that you can always extract out to. Because if you don't have the ability to concretize it, it isn't useful. It's actually nothing. Capital and investments are nothing if you can't turn them back into cash. So we need that. Well, you need banks to do that, or a central bank, or a group that basically manages interest rates to make sure that value is there, or to print more cash, or whatever it is. All that garbage. You need those things. That comes from the state. You need taxes that are pulling it out. You need states that are keeping laws in certain places, making sure capital's flowing where it needs to, that's waging war when it needs to make sure capital flows. Again, the only thing that matters is that X plus DX. It's at the base. It's at the center. It is the fucking center of it. Everything else is kind of just parts of it. That's the new thing. If that makes sense to everyone, I hope so. But I'm going to bounce. We did an hour. I think an hour is solid. Is there any major last little notes before I do so and head out? I'll give it a second. I'm happy to give it a second. I need to go cook a meal. Titan says, would there be a reason anarcho-capitalism is incoherent? It's up there. Again, what is organizing production And by production, I don't just literally mean what's being produced. I mean all production, including you, the production that's your desiring production. In capital, it is X plus dy, period. It's psychoanalytically, it's machinically, it's unconsciously controlling us and setting up what we're capable of, deferring pleasure, deferring desire, a lot of really complex things they're going to get into. We're not quite there yet. I'm trying to avoid it. But if you were to say, oh, well, look, we're just going to do like no state and we're going to try it like that. Well, again, what then do you think is going to happen? Capitalism can't operate without a single printed currency, period. It just can't. So anarcho-capitalism just doesn't fucking work. Like, it just doesn't work. In order to have capitalism, you have to have that one currency everyone can come back to. And as soon as you start realizing these things that are necessary to capitalism as we know it, then we can actually start talking about, oh, here's the things we can get rid of. Here's other machines that may work. Because there's stuff that's good. It's one of the things that's controversial and easily misread in these books is that D&G are like, one, they're not anti-capital. They're not pro-capital. They're talking about, like Marx did, these are the steps, these are the things to understand so we can get to the next thing and figure out what another step is. But capitalism has some good parts. It does. It's the breaking down of overcoding and codes that are harsh and brutal that we're seeing every day. The idea of sexuality, gender, and race being broken down as it is. This is the destruction of codes, by the way, because race is coded, gender is coded. The destruction of these things over time and are having to grapple with this, as well as many other things. This is good shit. This allows change. It allows, not to have this singular person at the top. It's really tough to sort of see past that, but it's not bad overall. So it's not bad. It's good stuff. There's a lot of awful things because, again, there's a lot of pieces to this. This isn't one single bit that's pushing us. A lot of complexity. So you end up in a really weird place where, like, I don't know. To me, it's about the emancipation of desire and it's about the emancipation of people. It's not about, oh, cool, we don't have capitalists anymore, so now we have central state communism or whatever, which is the same fucking thing. Pippa says, what is flux that surplus code is transformed into? Is it more desire? No, it's capital. It's capital, but it's an abstraction of capital. So the flux that, as they word it here, one second, I want to make sure I get it right. The differential relation expresses the fundamental capitalist phenomenon of the transformation of the surplus value of code. The surplus value of code is always produced with any sort of production. You end up with surplus code. But that surplus code turns into the surplus value of flux, the rate of profit and profit being able to be reinvested. This shift is pushing us towards understanding that capital is at the center, an abstraction of things. More complex than that, but that's the simple version. So surplus code within production is turned into the production of surplus value of flux. And that's the move there. Does that make sense, Pippa? Hope it does. And next week we're going into the dualism of money, which I really love. To read Brunoff really quick at the bottom here. The very notion of a monetary mass can have a meaning only relative to the workings of a system of credit where the different kinds of money combine. Without such a system, one would have only a sum of means of payment that would have no access to the social nature of the general equivalent and that could serve only in local private circuits. There'd be no general monetary circulation. Only in a centralized system can the different kinds of money become homogeneous and appear as components of an articulated whole. Really great fucking line. Marx on Money is amazing. Susanna Bernhoft rules. Really good book. Titan says, it feels to me there's a wave that will inevitably collapse. Well, it's a wave that will inevitably always be about to collapse. Like, Whether or not we survive it is a different beast, but capital as itself won't necessarily collapse. It may kill all of us as it does so, but it will always, and they talk about this sort of as the way that the internal limit of capital operates. There's a bunch of factories, people make stuff, and there's X amount of value in the system. But at some point, some dude invents a better mousetrap, and all of the industry changes. But it doesn't mean that social production changes. Instead, social production stays quite similar or the same. We've got efficiencies now that are extraordinary. I like to talk about it in terms of, let's say we had a farm, all of us, Titan, you, me, Pippa, Sunday, and everyone, we're all on this farm. And we're cut off from everything in the world. On this farm, we all work. I'm the guy who's got to get all the eggs from the chickens. But I invent a machine that can just do that for me. Now, there's two things that can happen, but there's a lot of things. How do we handle that? What do? Do we go, hey, it's cool, Brooks. You don't have to work anymore, but we're all going to keep working. That feels weird. Probably not good for everybody. What we do in our society is we go, okay, cool. That machine is invented. Brooks no longer has work. Therefore, he's going to starve to death or must find work elsewhere. That's kind of weird too, because we kind of constantly move into this place of making more value, more production, more of this abstraction, more of this capital that isn't able. Hey, can you close my door, sweetheart? I don't know if you can hear my 2-year-old who's really excited to be downstairs. Really excited to be downstairs. She wants me to come cook her dinner, so I'm going to go do that in a second. So what happens is capital's got this internal limit constantly. And this internal limit's always being displaced every time there are major shifts or major pushes. We have a technological advancement in America that's been extraordinary over the course of my lifetime, but my parents' lifetime, I can't even think about it. My grandparents' lifetime, good Lord. But it's always, oh yeah, cool, thanks, we'll figure it out next time. And that external limit never really matters. It's able to continually push and push and push. So capital will probably be fine if we can't figure out an alternative. And there's a lot of problems with finding an alternative, as we're already talking about here. How do we keep a lot of these things going that are good without reverting to, we don't want to go back to despotism. They're not anarcho-primitivists who want us to go back to a time where all of us are barely subsistent surviving. So what's the things we can change? How do we manage? And this is kind of, just to get to the end, how do we find a way to manage not just ourselves, but production of large-scale, important, big things, yet also make sure that we have a locality and a way of doing away with the way that the state infers its power. It's a really fascinating shift that has happened, but capital will always find a way to just keep going and to eternally push the further limit further and further and further. Deferred pleasure for eternity. How it works. Really awful, too. It sucks. Yeah. I'm going to try to avoid complex. There's a lot of. The problem raised again, I'm going to read this and then I'm going to bounce. This problem was raised again by Maurice Clavel in a series of decisive and willfully incompetent questions. Questions addressed to Marxist economists by someone who doesn't quite understand how one can maintain human surplus value as a basis for capitalist production, while recognizing that machines too work or produce value, that they have always worked. They work more and more in proportion to man, who thus ceases to be a constituent part of the production process in order to become adjacent to this process. Hence, there is a machinic surplus value produced by constant capital, which develops along with automation and productivity, and which cannot be explained by factors that counteract this falling tendency of profit, the increasing intensity of the exploitation of human labor, the diminution of the price of the elements of constant capital, since, on the contrary, these factors depend on it. It seems to us, with the same indispensable incompetence, these problems can only be viewed under the conditions of the transformation of the surplus value of code into a surplus value of flux. In defining pre-capitalist regimes by a surplus value of code, capitalism by a generalized decoding that converted this surplus value of code into a surplus value of flux, we were presenting things in a summary fashion. We were still acting as though the matter were settled once and for all at the dawn of a capitalism that had lost all code value. This is not the case, however. On the one hand, codes continue to exist, even as an archaism, but they assume a function that is perfectly contemporary and adapted to the situation within personified capital, the capitalist, the worker, merchant, banker. But on the other hand, more profoundly, every technical machine presupposes flux of a particular type, flux of code that are both interior and external to the machine, forming the elements of a technology and even a science. It is this flux of code that finds themselves encasted, coded, or overcoded in the pre-capitalist societies. In such a way, they never achieve independence. They are the blacksmith, the astronomer. But the decoding of flux in capitalism has freed, deterritorialized, and decoded the flux of code just as it has the others. To such a degree, this automatic machine has always increasingly internalized them in its body or its structure as a field of forces, while depending on a science or technology, on so-called intellectual labor, distinct from manual labor of the worker. In this sense, it is not machines that have created capitalism, but capitalism that creates machines that is constantly introducing breaks and cleavages through which it revolutionizes its technical modes of production. Love this fucking book. With that, hey Lisa, sorry, bad timing. But with that, I'm going to bounce and go cook some dinner here. I'm going to see if I can get Sunday to step on a little bit later, maybe come on and maybe game a little bit. But this has been great. Thank you guys for joining, and thank you for the open questions. I always appreciate people asking things they don't know, because none of us know, and we're all working our way through any of this shit. So please join me at the DGQC. Links below. Come say hi, subscribe, give a like, all that fun shit. I've got a bunch of videos starting to hit next week, and we're going to start having a lot more regular content here, which is going to be fun. So thank you all, and I will talk to you all soon.